August 1945, Tokyo, Japan. The surrender of the Japanese Empire did more than just end the most devastating conflict in human history. It tore the fabric of the existing world order apart. For decades, the map of Asia had been defined by the iron grip of colonial empires. The British in India and Malaya, the French in Indochina, the Dutch in Indonesia, and the Americans in the Philippines. But as the smoke cleared from the battlefields of the Pacific, the great imperial powers emerged from World War II not as masters of the East, but as exhausted, bankrupt, and politically fractured entities. In the sudden absence of Japanese authority, a terrifying vacuum opened across the continent. This was not a peaceful transition. It was a period of profound, violent chaos. For millions of people across Asia, the end of the war did not bring the promised stability of peace, but rather the unpredictable birth pangs of national identity. Across the various territories of Southeast Asia, the dream of independence had been simmering beneath the surface of colonial rule, fueled by the nationalist movements that had fought alongside the Allies against the Japanese. Now, those movements were no longer content to wait for permission from London, Paris, or The Hague. In Indonesia, Sukarno declared independence, only to be met by a Dutch attempt to reclaim their lost prize. In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed a new republic, standing in direct defiance of the returning French administration. The colonial era was dying, but it was refusing to go quietly. This was the great paradox of the post-war era. The very movement towards self-determination, decolonization, became the primary catalyst for the Cold War in Asia. What began as local struggles for sovereignty were almost immediately sucked into the gravity of the burgeoning superpower rivalry. The United States and the Soviet Union, fresh from their alliance in the fight against fascism, were now eyeing each other with profound suspicion. As the old colonial structures crumbled, they left behind a geopolitical landscape that was fragmented, unstable, and ripe for exploitation. To the Americans, the collapse of colonial order looked like a dangerous opening for the spread of international communism. To the Soviets, it represented a historic opportunity to support wars of national liberation and dismantle the remnants of Western imperialism. The vacuum was not just political, it was ideological. In the power voids left by departing colonial administrators and retreating Japanese garrisons, local actors were forced to choose sides. Was the path to modernity through Western-style capitalism and liberal democracy, or through the radical, egalitarian promise of Marxist-Leninist revolution? There was no middle ground, and there was no time for deliberation. The chaos of 1945 and 1946 provided the fertile soil in which the seeds of the next 3 decades of conflict were sown. As the imperial flags were lowered, they were replaced by the banners of new nations, but those nations would find themselves immediately caught in a global tug-of-war. The era of empire was over, but the era of ideological warfare had just begun. The stage was set for a struggle that would redefine the borders, the beliefs, and the very bloodlines of the Asian continent. August 1945, Nanjing, China. While the rest of Asia grappled with the receding tides of colonial empires, China faced a much older, more visceral crisis. The defeat of Imperial Japan had not brought a unified peace to the Middle Kingdom. Instead, it had removed the common enemy that had briefly held a fractured nation together. As the Japanese garrison surrendered, the long-simmering tension between the two titans of Chinese politics erupted into a full-scale struggle for the soul of the nation. On one side stood the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, led by the formidable Chiang Kai-shek. Backed by the United States and holding the formal mandate of government, the Nationalists represented the established order, urban elites, and a vision of a modernized, capitalist China. On the other side stood the Chinese Communist Party, led by the pragmatic and charismatic Mao Zedong. The Communists had spent years in the rugged hinterlands, building a grassroots power base among the peasantry, preaching a message of land reform and radical equality that resonated deeply in a country broken by decades of warlordism and foreign invasion. The fragile truce of the Second United Front dissolved almost instantly. For a moment, the Americans attempted to broker a coalition government, but the distrust between Chiang and Mao was too deep, the ideological chasm too wide. By 1946, the Civil War had reignited with a ferocity that shocked the world. At first, the nationalists held the advantage. With superior numbers, modern weaponry, and American logistical support, Chiang's forces surged into the liberated territories held by the Japanese. To many observers in Washington, the fall of the Communists seemed an impossibility. But the nationalists were fighting a war on two fronts, one against the rebels and another against their own internal rot. As the fighting intensified, the nationalist cause began to hemorrhage. The government was crippled by hyperinflation that wiped out the savings of the middle class, turning former supporters into bitter critics. Corruption within the Kuomintang ranks became systemic, with officers often more interested in personal enrichment than tactical cohesion. The military, though large, was a patchwork of divided loyalties, often more loyal to local commanders than to the central state. In contrast, the People's Liberation Army under Mao's command mastered the art of revolutionary warfare. They didn't just fight battles, they fought for the hearts and minds of the rural masses. Through disciplined land redistribution, they turned the peasantry into a sea of support, providing the communists with an inexhaustible supply of intelligence, food, and manpower. The communists moved like shadows through the countryside, using guerrilla tactics to bleed the nationalist armies dry before launching massive conventional offensives when the moment was right. By 1948, the momentum had shifted irrevocably. The great urban centers, the jewels of the nationalist regime, began to fall. The loss of Manchuria was the death knell. As the communist tide swept southward, the nationalist defense collapsed into a frantic, disorganized retreat. By late 1949, the unthinkable had happened. The nationalist government, once the recognized authority of the world's most populous nation, was forced to flee to the island of Taiwan. The mainland was lost. The revolution had succeeded. As the red flag rose over Beijing, the world realized that the geopolitical map of Asia had just been fundamentally and permanently rewritten. October 1, 1949, Beijing, China. Standing atop the rostrum of Tiananmen Gate, Mao Zedong looked out over a sea of red flags and cheering crowds to announce to the world that the Chinese people have stood up. It was a moment of profound, seismic significance. With those words, the People's Republic of China was born, signaling not just the end of a decades-long civil war, but the emergence of a new, formidable actor on the global stage. The birth of the PRC was more than a change in administration. It was a radical restructuring of the most populous nation on earth. The Communist Party immediately began a sweeping transformation of Chinese society. They dismantled the old feudal structures, implementing aggressive land reforms that redistributed property to the peasantry, effectively cementing the loyalty of the rural masses. They established a command economy, centralized political authority, and began the monumental task of consolidating power under a single, monolithic party structure. For the millions who had lived through the chaos of warlordism, foreign occupation, and hyperinflation, the new regime promised a sense of order and national dignity, even as it imposed a strict, authoritarian discipline. But as the dust of the revolution settled within China's borders, the echoes of this transformation were felt instantly in the corridors of power in Washington, Moscow, and London. To the West, the loss of China was viewed as a catastrophic geopolitical failure. The Truman administration was plunged into a period of intense political soul-searching and domestic finger-pointing. How had a nation backed by American aid and modern weaponry fallen to a peasant-based insurgency? This perceived failure fueled a new, more aggressive era of American foreign policy. The loss of China became a rallying cry for hardliners in the United States, driving the hardening of the containment doctrine and ensuring that the struggle against communism would no longer be confined to Europe, but would now be fought with ferocity across the Asian continent. Simultaneously, the birth of the PRC fundamentally altered the dynamics of the communist bloc. Initially, the relationship between Beijing and Moscow was one of revolutionary brotherhood. The Soviet Union, eager to see a fellow communist giant rise in the East, provided critical technical assistance, industrial blueprints, and military hardware to help the fledgling PRC stabilize. For a brief window, it appeared that a monolithic communist front was forming, stretching from the Elbe River in Germany to the shores of the Pacific. However, this alliance was built on shifting sands. While Mao and Stalin shared an ideological vocabulary, the two leaders harbored deep-seated suspicions regarding leadership and national sovereignty. Mao was not interested in being a junior partner to Moscow. He envisioned China as a central pillar of the global revolution, independent and autonomous. This tension, though simmering under the surface in 1949, would eventually boil over. But for now, the immediate reality was a massive shift in the global balance of power. The rise of the PRC meant that the Cold War in Asia would not be a series of isolated skirmishes, but a high-stakes confrontation involving a nuclear-capable, ideologically driven superpower. The stage was set. The vacuum of the post-war era had been filled, and the struggle for the future of Asia had entered its most dangerous and transformative chapter. Late 1949, Moscow, Soviet Union. While the world's eyes were fixed on the red flags flying over Tiananmen Square, the architects of the Kremlin were already busy redrawing the maps of the Far East. For Joseph Stalin, the victory of Mao Zedong was not merely a triumph of Marxist-Leninist ideology. It was a geopolitical windfall. The emergence of a communist China meant that the Soviet Union was no longer a solitary titan facing the West in a vacuum. It meant that the Iron Curtain, which had long been seen as a barrier dividing Europe, was now being extended across the vast expanse of the Eurasian landmass, stretching its shadow deep into the heart of Asia. This was the beginning of a new northern axis of power. The Soviet influence in North Asia was not a sudden conquest, but a calculated, multi-layered projection of strength. It began with the solidification of the buffer zones. To the north of the newly born PRC lay the Mongolian People's Republic, a satellite state that functioned as a strategic cushion, protecting the Soviet heartland from any potential instability or Western encroachment. By reinforcing the political and military structures of Mongolia, Moscow ensured that the Soviet frontier remained secure, even as the revolutionary fires spread southward. But the Soviet reach extended far beyond the steppes of Mongolia. In the maritime reaches of the North Pacific, the Soviet Union began to assert itself as a naval power of consequence. The establishment of strategic naval bases in places like Vladivostok and the expansion of influence in the Kuril Islands were not merely local concerns. They were signals to the United States and its allies that the Pacific Ocean was no longer an American lake. The Soviet Union was weaving a web of influence that linked the industrial might of the USSR with the burgeoning revolutionary energy of East Asia, creating a continuous block of communist-aligned territory that challenged the very foundations of Western maritime dominance. This expansion was fueled by a massive transfer of expertise and material. In the early years of this new era, the Soviet Union acted as the great brother of the communist movement. Through bilateral treaties, Moscow poured resources into the region, heavy industrial machinery to jumpstart command economies, military doctrine to train new revolutionary armies, and scientific advisors to build the infrastructure of the state. This was soft power, backed by the hard reality of Soviet steel. Yet beneath this veneer of fraternal cooperation, the seeds of a different kind of tension were being sown. The Soviet model was rigid, centralized, and profoundly suspicious of any deviation from the Moscow line. As the USSR worked to integrate North Asia into its sphere of influence, it was not just exporting revolution, it was exporting a specific, Moscow-centric way of life. This created a complex dynamic where the Soviet Union was simultaneously the essential patron of Asian communism and its most demanding overseer. As 1950 dawned, the geopolitical landscape had been irrevocably transformed. The Iron Curtain in the East was no longer a metaphor. It was a physical and ideological reality. From the frozen ports of the Pacific to the vast plains of Mongolia, a new front had been opened. The Cold War had shifted its center of gravity, and the struggle for the soul of Asia was now inextricably linked to the ambitions of the Kremlin. August 1945, the 38th parallel Korean Peninsula. As the Soviet shadow lengthened across North Asia, it found its most volatile focal point on a narrow strip of land that had, for decades, been defined by Japanese colonial rule. Korea was a nation poised on the edge of a precipice. The surrender of Imperial Japan had not brought the liberation the Korean people had envisioned, but rather a sudden, chaotic vacuum that the competing superpowers were all too eager to fill. The division of Korea was never intended to be a permanent surgical strike upon a nation's soul. It was meant to be a temporary administrative convenience. In the frantic final weeks of World War II, American planners, seeking to prevent a total Soviet occupation of the peninsula, proposed a line of demarcation to divide the zones of influence. They chose the 38th parallel, a line drawn hastily on a map in Washington, D.C., slicing through the heart of a unified cultural and historical identity. To the north, the Red Army surged into the peninsula with overwhelming force. For the Soviet command, Korea was a strategic necessity, a vital buffer to protect the Manchurian border and secure a foothold in the Pacific. In the northern reaches, under the watchful eye of Soviet administrators, the foundations of a new order were laid. They facilitated the rise of Kim Il-sung, a former guerrilla fighter, transforming the northern territory into a disciplined, highly centralized satellite state. Here, the Soviet model of command economics and military mobilization was rapidly institutionalized, turning the North into a hardened bastion of Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy. Yet, as the Soviet influence solidified in the North, a counterweight was forming in the South. The United States, wary of a total communist hegemony in East Asia, moved to establish its own sphere of influence. Through the United States Army military government in Korea, a different vision for the peninsula was being implemented. While the North embraced radical land reform and state control, the South became a theater for the struggle between traditionalist elites and various political factions, all under the increasingly heavy shadow of American containment policy. By 1948, the temporary administrative line had hardened into a political reality. The division was no longer just a matter of where soldiers stood. It was a matter of how people lived. The proclamation of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the North and the Republic of Korea in the South signaled the formalization of a schism. Two different governments, two different ideologies, and two different visions for the future of a single people now stood face to face across a barbed wire frontier. The 38th parallel had ceased to be a mere coordinate on a map. It had become a psychological wound, a physical manifestation of the global struggle between East and West. The Korean peninsula was no longer just a victim of colonial occupation. It had become the frontline of the Cold War in Asia. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the tension between the two Koreas was reaching a breaking point. The era of political maneuvering was drawing to a close, and the era of kinetic, bloody confrontation was about to begin. March 1947, Washington, D.C., United States. While the division of Korea was hardening on the ground, a seismic shift was occurring in the halls of American power. The geopolitical landscape had fundamentally changed. The wartime alliance with the Soviet Union had evaporated, replaced by a profound and growing sense of insecurity. In the United States, the sudden collapse of the nationalist government in China and the creeping expansion of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe sent shockwaves through the halls of Congress and the White House. The question was no longer how to rebuild a post-war world, but how to prevent that world from turning entirely red. President Harry S. Truman understood that the old era of isolationism was dead. To preserve the new international order, the United States had to adopt a new, proactive stance. This philosophy was codified in what would become known as the Truman Doctrine. Originally articulated to provide military and economic aid to Greece and Turkey to prevent them from falling under communist influence, the doctrine's implications for Asia were profound and far-reaching. It wasn't just about helping specific nations. It was about a global commitment to contain the spread of communism wherever it attempted to breach the gates of the free world. This was the birth of the containment strategy. As the 1940s drew to a close, the American strategic lens shifted toward the Pacific with renewed intensity. The loss of China in 1949, the victory of Mao Zedong's Communist Party over Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, acted as a massive catalyst for this anxiety. To American policymakers, the fall of China was not merely a local civil war. It was a catastrophic shift in the global balance of power. It suggested that the red tide was not just a European phenomenon, but a tidal wave sweeping across the entire Eastern Hemisphere. In Washington, the logic of containment became a rigid framework for all future foreign policy in Asia. It was built on the belief that communism was a monolithic expansionist force directed by Moscow. Therefore, any localized communist movement, whether in the jungles of Indochina, the mountains of Malaya, or the streets of Seoul, was viewed as a single, interconnected threat that had to be met with American resolve. This strategy transformed the United States from a distant observer into a permanent, interventionist guardian of the Pacific. It meant that the U.S. could no longer afford to let regional conflicts play out on their own terms. Under the umbrella of containment, every local insurgency, every border dispute, and every political upheaval in Asia was suddenly viewed through the prism of the great power struggle. The implications were clear. The United States would commit its economic might, its diplomatic weight, and, if necessary, its blood and treasure to hold the line. The Truman Doctrine had turned the map of Asia into a chessboard. The containment of communism was no longer a mere suggestion of policy. It had become the defining mission of the American century. And as the lines of influence were drawn from the shores of Japan to the heart of Southeast Asia, the world watched with bated breath, knowing that this strategy would inevitably lead to the first great test of fire. June 25, 1950, the 38th parallel Korean Peninsula. The chessboard that Washington had so carefully constructed was suddenly set ablaze. For years, the division of Korea at the 38th parallel had been a simmering tension, a frozen line on a map separating the Soviet-backed Democratic People's Republic in the north from the American-supported Republic of Korea in the south. But in the early hours of a summer morning, that tension shattered into total war. The North Korean People's Army, bolstered by Soviet T-34 tanks and heavy artillery, launched a massive, coordinated invasion across the parallel. The onslaught was overwhelming. The South Korean forces, ill-equipped and caught off guard, were driven back with terrifying speed. Within days, the capital of Seoul had fallen. To the policymakers in Washington, this was not merely a border skirmish. It was the first undeniable proof of the monolithic communist expansion they had so feared. If Korea fell, the dominoes in Japan and Southeast Asia would surely follow. The response was instantaneous. Invoking the authority of the newly formed United Nations, President Truman bypassed the traditional hesitations of war and committed American troops to the fight. This was the moment containment transitioned from a diplomatic doctrine into a military reality. The Korean War was no longer a local struggle for Korean unification. It had become the first great proxy conflict of the Cold War, a high-stakes collision between two competing visions of humanity. As UN forces, led by the United States, surged north to repel the invasion, they achieved a stunning success. Pushing the North Koreans back toward the Chinese border, the tide seemed to have turned in favor of the West. But the victory was short-lived. The red tide did not retreat, it mobilized. In late October, as UN troops approached the Yalu River, the shadow of a new superpower loomed. Mao Zedong, viewing the American advance as a direct threat to the newly established People's Republic of China, made a fateful decision. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese People's Volunteer Army soldiers surged across the border, descending upon the UN forces like a human wave. The conflict descended into a brutal, grinding war of attrition. The peninsula became a meat grinder where the ideologies of the East and West clashed in frozen trenches and blood-soaked valleys. While the fighting raged on the ground, the war was being fought on a global scale. The Soviet Union, though careful to avoid a direct nuclear confrontation with the United States, provided the North with vital intelligence, aircraft, and material, ensuring that the proxy war remained a contest of superpower endurance. By the time a tenuous armistice was signed in 1953, the landscape of Asia had been irrevocably altered. Millions were dead, and the peninsula remained divided, a scar on the earth that persists to this day. But more importantly, the Korean War had set the template for the decades to follow. It proved that the Cold War would not be fought through direct total war between the giants, but through localized, devastating conflicts in the developing world. It established the precedent of American military interventionism and solidified the reality that in the new Asian order, no local conflict was ever truly local. 1956, Moscow, Soviet Union. While the smoke was still clearing from the battlefields of Korea, a different kind of fire was beginning to smolder within the heart of the communist world. For a decade, the international communist movement had been viewed by the West as a monolithic, unbreakable bloc, directed by a single baton from the Kremlin. But the foundation of that unity was about to crack, and the fault line would run directly through the center of Asia. The catalyst was a single speech. Nikita Khrushchev, the new leader of the Soviet Union, delivered a secret speech denouncing the cult of personality and the brutal excesses of Joseph Stalin. To the Soviet leadership, this was de-Stalinization, a necessary evolution to modernize the socialist state. But to Mao Zedong, the architect of the Chinese Revolution, this was more than just a change in leadership. It was a betrayal of the revolutionary spirit. Mao viewed Khrushchev's reforms as revisionism, a cowardly softening of ideological purity that threatened to dilute the radical struggle against capitalism. From the perspective of Beijing, the Soviet Union was no longer the vanguard of the revolution, but a cautious, bureaucratic empire more concerned with coexistence with the West than with the global upheaval of the proletariat. As the 1950s progressed, the friction between Moscow and Beijing transitioned from ideological debates to a bitter, public rivalry for leadership of the communist world. The two giants began to compete for influence across the developing nations of Asia and Africa. Where the Soviets sought to build stable, state-centric socialist models, Mao championed a more militant, peasant-driven revolutionary fervor. The tension reached a breaking point in the early 1960s. The split was no longer just a disagreement over doctrine, it was a geopolitical divorce. The Soviet Union, fearing Mao's unpredictable radicalism, began to scale back its support for China, even going so far as to withdraw technical advisors and blueprints for vital industrial projects. This left the People's Republic of China isolated, economically vulnerable, and deeply suspicious of its northern neighbor. The fracture was cemented by a series of escalating provocations. By 1969, the ideological rift had metastasized into a terrifying military reality. Along the long, winding border between the two nations, massive troop concentrations faced off in high-altitude skirmishes. At Zhenbao Island, Soviet and Chinese forces engaged in direct, bloody combat, bringing the two largest communist powers to the very precipice of a nuclear exchange. The Sino-Soviet split fundamentally shattered the logic of the Cold War. The monolithic, communist threat that had terrified American policymakers for years had evaporated, replaced by a complex, three-way struggle for power. The world was no longer a simple binary of East versus West. It had become a volatile triangle. This fracture would have profound consequences for the decades to come. It paved the way for a shocking geopolitical realignment, as a weakened and isolated China began to look toward its greatest enemy, the United States, to balance the threat of the Soviet Union. The split ensured that the Cold War in Asia would not be a unified struggle of one ideology against another, but a chaotic, multipolar game of survival, where old enemies could become unexpected allies, and the lines of loyalty were written in shifting political sand. April 1955, Bandung, Indonesia. While the titans of the Cold War were busy carving the globe into spheres of influence, and while the communist bloc was beginning to fracture under the weight of the Sino-Soviet split, a different kind of movement was gathering momentum in the tropical warmth of West Java. For the newly independent nations of Asia and Africa, the global landscape felt less like a struggle for ideological truth and more like a tightening vice. The era of decolonization was in full swing, yet these emerging states found themselves caught in a suffocating crossfire. To the West, they were potential pawns in the containment of communism. To the East, they were battlegrounds for the spread of the proletarian revolution. The superpowers offered aid, but that aid almost always came with strings attached, strings that demanded loyalty, military bases, and a surrender of sovereignty. In the halls of the Jedung Merdeka, 29 nations gathered for a purpose that was, in many ways, an act of defiance. This was the Asian-African Conference, better known as the Bandung Conference. It brought together leaders who shared a common history of colonial struggle: Sukarno of Indonesia, Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Zhou Enlai of China, and Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. The atmosphere was charged with a unique tension. Here sat leaders from vastly different ideological camps. Nehru sought a path of democratic socialism. Zhou Enlai represented the rising dragon of communism, and Sukarno acted as the charismatic host, bridging the gap between the revolutionary and the diplomat. Yet, despite their internal disagreements, they were united by a singular, urgent realization: the Third World would not be a mere spectator to the Cold War. They would not be the foot soldiers in a conflict that was not their own. The Bandung Conference was the moment the Global South found its voice. The delegates drafted the 10 Principles of Bandung, a manifesto that championed sovereignty, territorial integrity, and most importantly, the equality of all races and nations. They called for an end to colonial rule and a refusal to become instruments of superpower rivalry. This was the embryonic stage of the non-aligned movement. It was a bold, if imperfect, attempt to create a third way, a geopolitical middle ground where nations could develop their own identities without being forced into the binary logic of Washington or Moscow. For the first time, the post-colonial world was asserting that its interests were not secondary to the struggle between capitalism and communism. However, the movement faced immediate skepticism. Western intelligence agencies viewed Bandung as a potential front for communist subversion, while some hardline revolutionaries saw non-alignment as a form of weakness. Even within the conference, the cracks of the Cold War were visible. The competing interests of the United States and the Soviet Union constantly pressured the delegates to pick a side. Yet the legacy of Bandung was undeniable. It shattered the illusion that the Cold War was a two-player game. It proved that the map of the world was being redrawn not just by nuclear arsenals, but by the collective will of nations reclaiming their agency. As the delegates departed Bandung, they left behind a new geopolitical reality. The world was no longer just East versus West. It was also the voices of the many, demanding a seat at the table. September 1945, Hanoi, Vietnam. While the diplomats in Bandung were debating the lofty ideals of sovereignty and non-alignment, the reality on the ground in Southeast Asia was far more visceral, bloodier, and dictated by the barrel of a gun. To understand the non-aligned struggle for agency, one must first understand the violent crucible that preceded it, the First Indochina War. For nearly a century, French Indochina had been a jewel in the crown of the French colonial empire. But the Second World War had shattered the myth of European invincibility. As the Japanese occupation swept through Southeast Asia, the French colonial administration was hollowed out, leaving a power vacuum that the Vietnamese nationalist movement, led by the charismatic and disciplined Ho Chi Minh, was all too eager to fill. In the wake of the Japanese surrender, Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh, a coalition of nationalists and communists, proclaimed the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. To the world, it was a cry for self-determination. To the French, it was an intolerable affront to their national prestige. Determined to reclaim their lost empire, the French military returned to Indochina, setting the stage for a grueling 8-year struggle that would transform a colonial rebellion into a central theater of the Cold War. What began as a localized fight for independence quickly became caught in the gravitational pull of the emerging bipolar world. As the conflict intensified, the ideological lines were drawn with lethal precision. The French, backed increasingly by the United States, which viewed any communist movement as a threat to the stability of the Pacific, fought to maintain the colonial status quo. On the other side, the Viet Minh found themselves bolstered by the logistical and ideological support of the newly established People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union. The war was not fought in grand, sweeping maneuvers, but in the suffocating heat of the jungle and the muddy trenches of the rice paddies. It was a war of attrition, a guerrilla struggle where the Viet Minh utilized their knowledge of the terrain and the support of the peasantry to bleed the French expeditionary forces dry. The climax of this struggle arrived in the spring of 1954, in a remote valley known as Dien Bien Phu. The French had established a massive fortified base, hoping to lure the Viet Minh into a conventional battle where superior firepower could crush the insurgency. Instead, they were met with a feat of engineering and willpower that defied Western military logic. Under the command of General Vo Nguyen Giap, the Viet Minh hauled heavy artillery through nearly impassable mountains, surrounding the French valley and raining fire down upon the besieged garrison. The fall of Dien Bien Phu was more than just a military defeat. It was the death knell of French colonialism in Asia. It signaled to the world that a determined revolutionary force, backed by the rising tide of communism, could defeat a major Western power. As the Geneva Accords were signed later that year, Indochina was partitioned at the 17th parallel, leaving a divided Vietnam and a fractured region. The French were gone, but the vacuum they left behind would not be filled by peace. Instead, it would be filled by the very thing the leaders at Bandung had feared: the direct, heavy-handed intervention of the superpowers, setting the stage for an even more devastating escalation. August 1954, Taipei. As the smoke cleared over the valleys of Dien Bien Phu and the French flag was lowered in Southeast Asia, a different kind of tension was tightening across the narrow stretch of water separating mainland China from the island of Taiwan. If the jungles of Indochina were the site of a colonial collapse, the Taiwan Strait was becoming the front line of a direct, existential confrontation between the two great ideologies of the age. The stage had been set years earlier, during the final, bloody throes of the Chinese Civil War. As the People's Liberation Army swept southward, the remnants of Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government fled to the island of Taiwan, bringing with them a government in exile that refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of the new communist regime in Beijing. For Mao Zedong, the presence of the nationalists on Taiwan was an unfinished chapter of the revolution, a strategic thorn in the side of the People's Republic. For the United States, Taiwan had become a vital, unsinkable aircraft carrier, a democratic bulwark positioned precisely where the communist tide met the open Pacific. The first major eruption of this tension arrived in 1954. Following the indecisive nature of the Geneva Accords, Beijing began a series of massive artillery bombardments against the islands of Kinmen and Matsu, located just miles off the mainland coast. This was no mere skirmish. It was a test of resolve. The United States, fearing a domino effect that would see the entire Pacific fall to communism, responded with a decisive show of force. Under the Formosa Resolution, President Eisenhower was granted the authority to use military force to protect Taiwan, effectively signaling that an attack on the island would be treated as an attack on American interests. The crisis deepened in 1955, but it was the year 1958 that brought the world to the precipice of a Third World War. The bombardment of the offshore islands intensified, turning the Taiwan Strait into a zone of constant kinetic friction. This was the era of brinkmanship, a high-stakes psychological game where both superpowers pushed each other to the very edge of conflict, gambling that the other side would blink first. The stakes were terrifyingly high. We were no longer talking about localized insurgencies or colonial rebellions. We were talking about the possibility of a nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet-backed People's Republic of China. The U.S. Seventh Fleet was deployed to the strait, its warships cutting through the waves as a silent, steel warning to Beijing. These crises transformed the Taiwan Strait from a mere maritime boundary into a permanent flashpoint of the Cold War. It solidified the two China's dilemma that continues to haunt global diplomacy to this day. As the Americans bolstered their presence in the Pacific, and the Chinese fortified their coastlines, the strait became a symbol of the frozen conflict that defined the era, a place where the ideological battle lines were not drawn in the sand, but etched in the very currents of the sea. The Pacific was no longer just a theater of war. It had become a chessboard where a single miscalculation could set the entire world ablaze. 1955, Malaya. While the world's eyes were fixed on the high-stakes brinkmanship of the Taiwan Strait, a different, more insidious form of conflict was festering in the dense, humid jungles of Southeast Asia. If the Taiwan Strait was a game of grand strategic chess played by superpowers, the burgeoning insurgencies across the Malay Peninsula, Thailand, and Indonesia were a gritty, asymmetric struggle for the very soul of the post-colonial world. The collapse of European colonial authority had left a profound power vacuum. In many Southeast Asian nations, the promise of independence was not met with stability, but with a bitter question: who would lead the new states? For many radicalized nationalists and peasant movements, the answer lay in the Marxist-Leninist ideology flowing from Beijing and Moscow. They saw the struggle for independence from Western masters as inseparable from the global struggle against capitalism. In Malaya, the conflict was already well underway. The Malayan Emergency, launched by British colonial forces to combat the Malayan National Liberation Army, was a brutal war of attrition. These communist guerrillas, largely composed of ethnic Chinese, utilized the jungle as both a shield and a weapon, striking at rubber plantations and tin mines, the economic lifeblood of the British Empire. It was a conflict that forced the West to realize that containing communism required more than just naval fleets. It required the difficult, grinding work of counterinsurgency and nation-building. The pattern began to repeat across the region. In Thailand, the shadow of the communist movement loomed over the Central Plains and the rugged northern borders, threatening to destabilize a monarchy that served as a crucial American ally. In Indonesia, the political landscape was a powder keg. The tension between the nationalist government, the military, and the massive, well-organized Indonesian Communist Party, the PKI, created a volatile environment where ideology was not just debated in parliaments, but fought for in the streets and the villages. These were not merely localized rebellions. They were the small wars of the Cold War. They were the testing grounds for the domino theory, the terrifying American belief that if one nation in the region fell to communism, the rest would inevitably follow like a row of falling tiles. This fear fundamentally altered the way the United States approached Southeast Asia. No longer content with mere diplomatic presence, Washington began to pour resources, intelligence, and military advisors into the region, transforming local grievances into theaters of global ideological warfare. The rise of these insurgencies meant that the Cold War in Asia was no longer just a matter of borders, nuclear silos, or naval blockades. It had become a war of shadows, fought in the periphery, where the combatants were often local revolutionaries, and the battlefields were the villages of the poor. As the 1950s progressed, the Southeast Asian jungle became a grim laboratory for the new age of conflict, a place where the grand theories of containment met the messy, violent reality of decolonization, setting the stage for the even more catastrophic escalations that were to come. 1954, Dien Bien Phu. The echoes of the French defeat at this remote valley outpost signaled more than just the end of an empire. They signaled the beginning of a geopolitical nightmare. As the smoke cleared from the Indochina War, the Geneva Accords attempted to carve a temporary truce along the 17th parallel, dividing Vietnam into a communist north under Ho Chi Minh and a western-aligned south. But this was a fragile partition, a line drawn in the sand that neither side truly respected. By the late 1950s, the localized struggle for Vietnamese independence was rapidly being swallowed by the maw of the global Cold War. In the north, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam was consolidating power, fueled by ideological fervor and the logistical support of the Soviet Union and a rising China. In the south, the regime in Saigon, desperate to prevent a communist takeover, became increasingly reliant on the United States. What had begun as a decolonization struggle was now being reframed through the lens of Washington's most primal fear, the domino theory. The transition from political tension to active combat was incremental but relentless. Throughout the early 1960s, the conflict was characterized by the shadow war of the Viet Cong, the National Liberation Front. These were the ghosts of the jungle, guerrilla fighters who utilized sophisticated tunnel networks, booby traps, and the dense canopy to wage a war of attrition against a technologically superior foe. They did not seek to win conventional battles. They sought to exhaust the will of the enemy. For the United States, the commitment began with advisors, military personnel sent to train and bolster the South Vietnamese army. But as the insurgency intensified and the political stability of Saigon faltered, the advisory role became a facade. The creeping escalation was a response to a perceived existential threat. If South Vietnam fell, the logic went, then Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand would surely follow. The containment of communism was no longer a matter of diplomatic pressure. It was becoming a matter of American blood and treasure. By 1964, following the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the fuse was lit. The United States moved from a posture of support to one of direct, massive military intervention. The conflict had officially mutated. It was no longer a civil war or a localized insurgency. It had transformed into a high-intensity, superpower proxy conflict. The jungles of Vietnam were now being saturated with American napalm, Agent Orange, and heavy artillery, while the North was supplied with an endless stream of Soviet anti-aircraft missiles and Chinese weaponry. This was the terrifying reality of the new Cold War, a collision between two incompatible worlds. On one side, a disciplined, highly motivated guerrilla force fighting for national liberation and communist hegemony. On the other, the world's preeminent superpower attempting to hold back a tidal wave of ideology through sheer kinetic force. As the scale of the war exploded, the theater of conflict expanded, drawing in the surrounding regions and ensuring that the struggle for Vietnam would become the defining and most polarizing crucible of the 20th century. May 1966, Beijing. While the jungles of Southeast Asia were being consumed by the fires of American napalm and North Vietnamese artillery, a different, perhaps more devastating kind of fire was being ignited within the borders of the People's Republic of China. This was not a war against a foreign invader, but a war against the self. This was the great proletarian cultural revolution. To understand this upheaval, one must look past the battlefields of Vietnam and into the fractured psyche of the Chinese Communist Party. By the mid-1960s, Mao Zedong, the architect of the revolution, found himself increasingly sidelined by pragmatic leaders like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, who sought to stabilize the economy through moderate reforms. To Mao, this pragmatism was a betrayal, a creeping return of capitalism that threatened the very soul of the revolution. He feared that a new bureaucratic elite was forming, a class of revisionists who were more interested in stability than the eternal struggle of the masses. In a move of unprecedented political audacity, Mao bypassed the established party hierarchy and appealed directly to the youth. He called for a continuous revolution, urging the students of China to rise up and smash the four olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. He issued the Little Red Book, a portable gospel of his personal ideology, turning it into a talisman for a generation hungry for purpose and radical change. The result was a descent into organized chaos. The Red Guards, paramilitary groups of students, emerged as the vanguard of this movement. They didn't just protest, they hunted. They descended upon universities, government offices, and even their own families, seeking out anyone branded a class enemy. Intellectuals, teachers, and even seasoned party officials were subjected to struggle sessions, public humiliations that often descended into physical violence and death. Temples were ransacked, ancient texts were burned, and the cultural heritage of millennia was systematically dismantled in the name of ideological purity. As China turned inward, consumed by this fever dream of radicalism, The geopolitical implications were profound. The Cultural Revolution effectively paralyzed the Chinese state. While the country's leadership was busy purging itself, its ability to project power or engage in coherent foreign policy was severely compromised. This internal volatility created a massive vacuum in the heart of Asia. For the United States, the chaos in China was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it meant that the massive communist neighbor was too preoccupied with its own internal purging to intervene directly in the Vietnam War. On the other, the unpredictability of Mao's regime made the regional landscape even more volatile. The Red Menace was no longer a monolithic, predictable bloc. It was a wild card, a nation undergoing a violent, self-inflicted metamorphosis. The Cultural Revolution would last a decade, leaving a trail of broken lives, shattered traditions, and a traumatized generation. It served as a grim reminder that in the high-stakes game of the Cold War, the most dangerous front lines were not always found on a map of foreign territories, but within the very heart of the nations themselves. As China struggled to redefine its identity through blood and fire, the dominoes in Southeast Asia continued to teeter, caught in the crossfire of an ideological storm that knew no borders. 1965, Washington, D.C. While the streets of Beijing were filled with the frenzied chants of the Red Guards, the halls of power in the United States were gripped by a different, more calculated form of terror. This wasn't the terror of a mob, but the terror of a calculation. To the architects of American foreign policy, the chaos in China and the escalating insurgency in South Vietnam were not isolated incidents. They were the first movements in a terrifying symphony of collapse. This was the era of the domino theory. The concept was deceptively simple, yet it would become the psychological engine driving American intervention in Asia for a generation. It posited that communism was not merely a political movement, but a contagious force, a biological imperative that, once it took root in one nation, would inevitably topple its neighbors in a rapid, unstoppable sequence. If South Vietnam fell to the north, the theory warned, then Laos would follow, then Cambodia, then Thailand, then perhaps Malaysia, Indonesia, and eventually, the very shores of the Pacific. To President Lyndon B. Johnson and his advisors, Southeast Asia was not just a collection of sovereign states, it was a fragile line of defense. The containment policy, established by George Kennan decades earlier, had evolved from a strategy of political pressure into a doctrine of existential survival. The logic was cold and binary. In the struggle between the free world and the communist bloc, there could be no middle ground. Every inch of territory lost to a revolutionary movement was seen as a crack in the dam that, once breached, would lead to a global deluge. This fear transformed the Vietnam War from a localized civil conflict into a crusade for regional stability. The American military machine was no longer just fighting a guerrilla insurgency in the Mekong Delta. It was fighting to hold back a tidal wave. This perception justified a staggering escalation of force. If the stakes were truly the survival of Southeast Asia, then no price was too high. Napalm, heavy artillery, and massive troop deployments were viewed not as acts of aggression, but as necessary measures to keep the dominoes standing. However, the domino theory possessed a fatal flaw. It viewed Southeast Asia through a lens of Western abstraction, often ignoring the complex, deeply rooted nationalist aspirations that fueled these movements. To the American eye, a communist insurgent was a pawn of Moscow or Beijing. To the insurgent, the struggle was often about decolonization, land reform, and the reclamation of national identity from foreign powers. By treating every local uprising as a move on a global chessboard, the United States risked fighting a war against people rather than ideologies. As the mid-1960s progressed, this ideological fever gripped the American psyche. The fear of a red tide sweeping through the tropics created a sense of urgency that bypassed nuance and ignored diplomacy. The dominoes were perceived as being in constant motion, teetering on the edge of a precipice. And as the United States committed more blood and treasure to prevent the first fall, it became increasingly clear that in trying to stop the dominoes, Washington might find itself caught in a cycle of escalation that no amount of military might could ever truly contain. January 30, 1968, South Vietnam. The illusion of progress was shattered in a single, coordinated heartbeat. For months, the American public had been fed a steady diet of optimism. General William Westmoreland, the commander of U.S. forces, had been issuing confident reports from Saigon, suggesting that the enemy was exhausted, that the light was at the end of the tunnel, and that the North Vietnamese were incapable of any major offensive. The American people were being told that the tide had turned, and that the massive commitment of troops and resources was finally yielding results. But while the military establishment was projecting an image of stability, the North Vietnamese leadership and the Viet Cong were preparing a devastating psychological blow. At the stroke of midnight, the silence of the Lunar New Year, the Tet holiday, was obliterated by the roar of explosions and the crack of gunfire. In a massive, simultaneous strike, communist forces launched an offensive against more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam. This was not a localized skirmish in the jungle. This was a full-scale assault on the very heart of the South Vietnamese state. The most shocking moment of the offensive occurred in the streets of Saigon, where Viet Cong commandos breached the walls of the U.S. Embassy. For a few harrowing moments, the very symbol of American power and protection in Southeast Asia was under direct siege. Images of combat within the embassy grounds were broadcast across the globe, sending a shockwave through the halls of power in Washington and into the living rooms of millions of Americans. Military analysts would later argue that the Tet Offensive was a tactical failure for the Communists. The Viet Cong suffered staggering casualties, and their attempt to trigger a general uprising among the South Vietnamese population failed to materialize. In terms of sheer battlefield dominance, the United States and its allies held the line. But in the realm of perception, the outcome was a catastrophe. The offensive had exposed a profound and widening gap between the reality of the war and the narrative being presented by the government. The light at the end of the tunnel had been revealed as a mirage. The sheer scale and coordination of the attack proved that despite years of escalation, the enemy was not retreating. They were merely waiting. As these images flashed onto television screens, the psychological impact was irreversible. The war was no longer a distant, manageable conflict being fought to preserve the dominoes. It was a chaotic, seemingly endless quagmire. The American public, previously divided but largely supportive of the mission, began to experience a profound sense of betrayal. If the generals were wrong about the strength of the enemy, what else were they wrong about? This was the moment the war moved from the jungles of Vietnam into the heart of the American psyche. The Tet Offensive did not break the military strength of the United States, but it broke the national will to continue the fight. It transformed the Vietnam War from a strategic necessity into a domestic crisis, fueling a massive anti-war movement that would soon grow into a political tidal wave. The dominoes were still standing, but the foundation of American consensus had begun to crumble. 1969, Phnom Penh, Cambodia. As the American consensus crumbled under the weight of the Tet Offensive, the tremors of instability did not stop at the Vietnamese border. They spilled over into the neighboring kingdom of Cambodia, a nation that had long attempted to maintain a precarious neutrality amidst the raging ideological storm of Southeast Asia. But in the logic of the Cold War, neutrality was often a luxury that the shifting tides of conflict would not permit. For years, Prince Norodom Sihanouk had played a delicate diplomatic game. He sought to balance the influence of the United States against the growing revolutionary fervor of North Vietnam and China. By allowing communist forces to utilize sanctuaries along the Cambodian border, Sihanouk hoped to keep his country out of the direct line of fire. It was a high-stakes gamble, a policy of appeasement intended to preserve sovereignty through tactical concessions. However, the escalation of the war in Vietnam rendered this balance impossible. As the United States intensified its bombing campaigns and expanded its operations to strike North Vietnamese supply lines, the Cambodian countryside became a secondary theater of the great power struggle. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was no longer a distant logistical network. It was a vein running through the heart of Cambodian territory. By the late 1960s, the internal fabric of Cambodia began to fray. The presence of foreign troops and the constant shadow of aerial bombardment radicalized a new generation of Cambodians. While the urban elite in Phnom Penh clung to the traditional structures of the monarchy, the rural peasantry watched as their villages were caught in the crossfire of a war that was not their own. Deep in the jungles, a different kind of force was germinating. The Khmer Rouge, a radical Maoist insurgent group, began to exploit this growing resentment. They were the ideological children of the era's volatility, highly disciplined, fiercely xenophobic, and driven by a vision of a primitive, agrarian utopia. They did not merely want to influence the Cambodian government. They wanted to dismantle the very concept of the modern state. The seeds of instability were being sown by two converging forces: the external pressure of the American military machine and the internal rot of political polarization. As the United States sought to disrupt communist sanctuaries, it inadvertently destabilized the very government that was trying to contain them. The distinction between the Vietnamese conflict and the Cambodian reality was evaporating. The vacuum left by the eroding authority of Prince Sihanouk was rapidly being filled by chaos. The struggle was no longer just about containment or the domino theory. It was becoming a descent into a localized, visceral civil war. The lines were being drawn between the traditionalists and the revolutionaries, between the urban centers and the radicalized countryside. As we look toward the coming decade, it becomes clear that Cambodia was no longer a buffer zone. It had become a fuse. The instability brewing in its forests was about to ignite a conflagration that would not only consume the nation, but would leave a scar on the history of the Cold War that would never truly heal. The dominoes were no longer just falling. They were being pushed into an abyss. 1969, Washington, D.C. While the jungles of Southeast Asia were being consumed by the fires of localized civil war, a much more silent, much more terrifying dimension of the Cold War was intensifying across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. As the ground war in Vietnam became a quagmire, the strategic calculus of the superpowers shifted from the control of territory to the mastery of absolute destruction. The struggle for influence in Asia was no longer being measured solely in hectares of jungle or the number of insurgent battalions, but in megatons and delivery systems. For much of the early Cold War, the nuclear shadow had been concentrated in the Atlantic and across the European plains. But by the late 1960s, the Pacific was rapidly becoming a primary theater for the nuclear arms race. The geography of the conflict was changing. The United States, seeking to maintain its containment perimeter, began to lean more heavily on its massive naval and aerial superiority, turning the Pacific into a sprawling network of nuclear-capable bases. From Guam to Okinawa, and through the strategic waters of the South China Sea, the American nuclear umbrella was being extended to cover a theater that felt increasingly unstable. But the Soviet Union was not merely a spectator to this expansion. As the Sino-Soviet split deepened, turning the two communist giants into bitter rivals, the Kremlin found itself facing a dual challenge: containing American influence in the Pacific while simultaneously keeping a wary, watchful eye on a newly nuclear-capable China. The Soviet Pacific Fleet began to grow in sophistication, seeking to challenge American maritime hegemony and ensure that the blue water of the Pacific did not become an exclusively Western lake. Perhaps the most volatile variable in this equation, however, was the People's Republic of China. Under the leadership of Mao Zedong, China had viewed the nuclear monopoly of the superpowers with a mixture of contempt and existential dread. To Mao, the paper tiger of nuclear weapons was a tool of imperialist bullying. Yet he understood that to be a true global power, China could not remain a mere target. The race was on. In 1964, China had successfully detonated its first atomic device, signaling to the world that the ideological struggle in Asia was now backed by the ultimate deterrent. This created a terrifying tripolar dynamic. In the Pacific, it was no longer a simple game of chess between two players. It was a three-way race of escalation. The United States sought to project power through carrier strike groups and submarine-launched missiles. The Soviet Union sought to secure its eastern flank and project naval strength. And China sought to achieve a level of parity that would guarantee its survival in an era of unprecedented volatility. As the 1960s drew to a close, the Pacific was being transformed into a high-tech chessboard of existential risk. The tension was no longer just about the movement of troops through the Mekong Delta or the political stability of Phnom Penh. It was about the silent, patrolling shadows of nuclear submarines and the long-range missiles capable of turning entire metropolitan centers into ash. The domino theory had evolved. It was no longer just about the fall of governments, but about the potential for a nuclear flashpoint that could ignite the entire hemisphere. February 1972, Beijing. The world watched in stunned silence as the heavy gates of the Great Hall of the People opened, not to a delegation of American diplomats, but to the unexpected arrival of Richard Nixon. This was not merely a diplomatic visit. It was a geopolitical earthquake that shattered 2 decades of ideological frozenness. For 23 years, the People's Republic of China had been a forbidden zone to the West, a revolutionary monolith that the United States had spent much of the Cold War attempting to isolate and contain. But by the dawn of the 1970s, the board had changed. The tripolar dynamic that had turned the Pacific into a powder keg was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a reality. The bitter, bloody rivalry between the Soviet Union and China had reached a breaking point, with both nations massing troops along their shared borders. For the United States, caught in the exhausting, soul-crushing quagmire of the Vietnam War, the strategic landscape was becoming untenable. Washington realized that the old binary logic of the Cold War, a simple struggle between capitalism and communism, was obsolete. Enter Henry Kissinger and the doctrine of realpolitik. Driven by a cold, unsentimental calculation of national interest, the Nixon administration began a clandestine dance of back-channel diplomacy. The goal was not to find common ground on ideology, but to exploit the cracks in the communist bloc. If the United States could bridge the chasm with Beijing, it could drive a wedge between the two giants of the East, effectively using China as a strategic counterweight to Soviet expansionism. Nixon's journey to China was a masterpiece of political theater and high-stakes gambling. As he walked through the Forbidden City, he was doing more than just shaking hands with Premier Zhou Enlai. He was fundamentally rewriting the rules of global engagement. The Great Rapprochement was designed to achieve three critical objectives: to gain leverage in the ongoing negotiations to end the Vietnam War, to isolate the Soviet Union through triangular diplomacy, and to create a new balance of power that could prevent a catastrophic nuclear confrontation in the Pacific. The impact was instantaneous. The visit signaled to Moscow that the era of unchallenged Soviet influence in Asia was over. It signaled to Beijing that they were no longer a pariah state, but a central player on the world stage. Yet, this rapprochement came with a profound irony. In the pursuit of stability and the management of the superpower rivalry, the United States was forming a marriage of convenience with a regime that remained ideologically hostile to everything Washington stood for. As the images of Nixon and Mao's representatives filled television screens across the globe, the domino theory began to lose its grip on American foreign policy. The world was no longer a collection of falling tiles. It was a complex, interconnected web of shifting interests. The Great Rapprochement did not bring immediate peace, nor did it resolve the tensions in Southeast Asia, but it did change the geometry of the Cold War forever. The chessboard had been reset, and for the first time in a generation, the United States was playing a game where the most dangerous enemy could suddenly become the most vital ally. April 30, 1975, Saigon. If Nixon's journey to Beijing was a masterpiece of calculated diplomacy, the final days in Saigon were a masterpiece of chaos and desperation. The strategic chessboard had indeed been reset, but for the people of South Vietnam, the game was reaching a brutal, definitive conclusion. The triangular diplomacy that had sought to balance the giants of the East had succeeded in its geopolitical aims, but it had also signaled to the North Vietnamese leadership that the American umbrella was being withdrawn. The era of containment was retreating, leaving a vacuum that the North was all too eager to fill. By the spring of 1975, the momentum had shifted irrevocably. The North Vietnamese Spring Offensive, a massive, coordinated surge of armor and infantry, was tearing through the South Vietnamese defenses with terrifying speed. The fall of the Central Highlands and the subsequent collapse of the South Vietnamese army created a domino effect that no amount of American rhetoric could halt. In Washington, the political will to intervene had evaporated, consumed by a public weary of war and a Congress determined to limit executive power. The domino theory, once the bedrock of American interventionism, was being replaced by a grim realization: the dominoes had already fallen. The atmosphere in Saigon during those final weeks was one of pure, unadulterated panic. As the North Vietnamese tanks rumbled closer to the capital, the city became a pressure cooker of fear. The frantic sounds of helicopters thumping over the skyline became the soundtrack to an exodus. Operation Frequent Wind, the largest helicopter evacuation in history, was underway. On the rooftops of crumbling villas and government buildings, men, women, and children clung to the skids of Hueys, desperate to escape a future they could not foresee. The imagery was haunting. Through the graininess of television news feeds, the world watched as the once grand boulevards of Saigon, a city that had been a symbol of Western influence in Southeast Asia, became a landscape of refugees and retreating soldiers. There was no grand, cinematic battle for the city. Instead, there was the slow, agonizing realization that the end had arrived. When the final American helicopters lifted off from the U.S. Embassy, leaving behind a city in total upheaval, the era of American primacy in Southeast Asia effectively ended. As the North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the Independence Palace, the Republic of Vietnam ceased to exist. Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City, marking a total victory for the communist forces and a profound psychological defeat for the United States. The fall of Saigon was more than just the conclusion of a localized conflict. It was the closing of a chapter in the Cold War. It proved that the superpower struggle could be won not just through nuclear brinkmanship, but through the sheer, grinding endurance of revolutionary willpower. It left the United States searching for a new identity in a post-Vietnam world, and it left Southeast Asia to grapple with the scars of a war that had pitted neighbor against neighbor and ideology against ideology. The great shift had occurred. The American dream of containment had been checked, and the geopolitical map of Asia had been redrawn in blood and iron. April 17, 1975, Phnom Penh. As the dust settled on the fall of Saigon, a different, more terrifying shadow began to lengthen over the neighboring kingdom of Cambodia. While the North Vietnamese had entered Saigon with the organized momentum of a conventional state army, the forces entering Phnom Penh were something far more radical, far more unpredictable, and infinitely more lethal. They were the Khmer Rouge. For years, Cambodia had been a casualty of the broader Cold War struggle, a neutral ground caught in the crossfire of the Vietnam War. The secret American bombing campaigns intended to disrupt North Vietnamese supply lines had inadvertently destabilized the country, fueling the rise of radicalism and driving a desperate peasantry into the arms of Pol Pot's Communist Party of Kampuchea. As the Khmer Rouge units poured into the capital, the atmosphere was not one of liberation, but of a sudden, suffocating stillness. The revolution that followed was unlike any other in the communist world. Pol Pot and his inner circle, driven by a fanatical agrarian vision of a year zero, sought to forcibly reset history. They did not merely want to change the government, they wanted to dismantle civilization itself. Within days of taking power, the Khmer Rouge issued a chilling decree: the total evacuation of all urban centers. Under the barrel of a gun, millions of people, doctors, teachers, monks, and shopkeepers, were driven from their homes at gunpoint into the countryside. The cities, once vibrant centers of culture, were transformed into ghost towns. The goal was a pure, classless, agrarian utopia, where the new people of the cities would be re-educated through grueling manual labor in the fields, and the old people of the peasantry would form the backbone of a new, primitive society. But this utopia was a blueprint for genocide. In the pursuit of ideological purity, the Khmer Rouge targeted anyone perceived as an enemy of the state. To wear glasses was to be an intellectual. To speak a foreign language was to be a traitor. To have even a hint of Western influence was a death sentence. The social fabric of Cambodia was not just torn, it was incinerated. The country was carved into zones of terror. In the labor camps and the killing fields, starvation, disease, and systematic execution became the tools of social engineering. The regime's paranoia was absolute, fueled by a desire to purge any element that could challenge their absolute control. As the mid-1970s progressed, the death toll climbed into the millions. A staggering percentage of the nation's population vanished into the earth. This was the darkest expression of the Cold War's ideological extremes. It was a tragedy born from the intersection of local radicalism and the geopolitical instability of the era. While the superpowers engaged in high-stakes chess matches of diplomacy and proxy wars, the people of Cambodia were being consumed by a localized firestorm of madness. The tragedy of the Khmer Rouge serves as a grim reminder that when the grand theories of political science are applied with murderous fanaticism, the cost is measured not in territory or influence, but in the very soul of a people. February 17, 1979, the Sino-Vietnamese border. While the Cambodian genocide was unfolding in a vacuum of madness, the geopolitical tectonic plates of Asia were shifting in a direction that few could have predicted. The monolithic communist bloc was a myth. In reality, the rift between the Soviet Union and China had widened into a canyon, and by the late 1970s, Vietnam had chosen a side. By aligning itself closely with Moscow, Hanoi had effectively become the Soviet Union's strategic outpost in Southeast Asia, a move that Beijing viewed as an act of encirclement. The catalyst for open conflict was the nightmare in Cambodia. As the Khmer Rouge's atrocities mounted, Vietnam saw an opportunity to secure its western flank. In late 1978, North Vietnamese troops launched a massive invasion of Cambodia, toppling Pol Pot's regime and installing a pro-Hanoi government. To China, this was more than just a regional intervention. It was a violation of the regional order and a manifestation of Soviet expansionism. Beijing saw a puppet state being installed on its doorstep by a Soviet-backed proxy. Deng Xiaoping, the architect of China's modernization, viewed the situation through the lens of punitive realism. China could not allow Vietnam to become a regional hegemon backed by the Soviet superpower. The decision was made. China would launch a lesson to teach Vietnam a hard truth about the costs of its alignment. On the morning of February 17, the silence of the mountainous borderlands was shattered by the roar of heavy artillery. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese People's Liberation Army troops surged across the frontier, launching a multi-pronged assault on several Vietnamese provincial capitals. This was not a war of conquest or long-term occupation. It was a lightning strike designed to be fast, brutal, and highly visible. The fighting was savage. The two armies, both battle-hardened by decades of previous conflicts, engaged in high-intensity, conventional warfare. The terrain, dense jungles and rugged limestone hills, turned every ridge into a bloody stalemate. For the soldiers on the ground, the ideological veneer of communist brotherhood evaporated instantly, replaced by the visceral reality of brother fighting brother. China's stated objective was to destroy Vietnam's military infrastructure and withdraw quickly. However, the cost of this lesson was immense. The Chinese military, still transitioning from a Maoist guerrilla force to a modern professional army, suffered staggering casualties. They encountered a Vietnamese defense that was deeply entrenched and fiercely motivated. By March, after several weeks of intense combat and the destruction of several key cities, the Chinese forces began their withdrawal. On paper, the war was a tactical stalemate, but the geopolitical implications were seismic. China had demonstrated its willingness to use force to check Soviet influence, and Vietnam had proven its resilience, even as it became increasingly isolated from the communist world. The Sino-Vietnamese War signaled the final death of the idea of a unified communist front in Asia. The Cold War had entered a new, more complex phase, a triangular struggle where the lines between friend and foe were no longer drawn by ideology, but by the cold, calculating pursuit of national interest. The brothers had fought, and in the smoke of the borderlands, the new reality of a multipolar, fractured Asia was born. December 1979, Kabul, Afghanistan. As the smoke cleared from the borderlands of Vietnam and China, the world believed the fractures within the communist bloc had reached their peak. But while Beijing and Moscow were busy settling scores in Southeast Asia, a new, even more volatile fuse was being lit in the rugged mountains of Central Asia. The geopolitical tremors that had shaken the Sino-Vietnamese border were about to trigger a seismic shift that would bleed the Soviet Union dry and fundamentally alter the landscape of the global Cold War. For years, Afghanistan had been a patchwork of tribal loyalties and simmering instability. However, in April 1978, a violent coup known as the Sour Revolution brought the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, a Marxist-Leninist faction, to power. The new regime, backed by Soviet advisors, attempted to force a rapid, radical modernization upon a deeply traditional Islamic society. The result was not progress, but chaos. Violent uprisings erupted across the countryside, and the fledgling communist government found itself losing control to a fierce, decentralized insurgency of mujahideen fighters. In Moscow, the Kremlin watched with growing anxiety. To the Soviet leadership, a collapse of the Afghan communist government was not merely a local problem. It was a strategic nightmare. If Afghanistan fell into the hands of radical Islamic fundamentalists, it could destabilize the Soviet Union's own Central Asian republics. Even more terrifying to the aging Soviet hawks was the prospect of a domino effect, where the United States or China might gain a foothold in the vacuum left by a failed satellite state. The decision was made in the shadows of the Kremlin. The Soviet Union would not allow its client state to fall. On Christmas Eve, 1979, the quiet of the Afghan night was shattered. In a massive, coordinated operation, Soviet airborne troops and armored divisions surged across the border. This was not a mere advisory mission. It was a full-scale invasion. The Soviet High Command's objective was surgical: quickly decapitate the existing leadership, install a more stable and compliant pro-Moscow regime, and secure the borders. They succeeded in the short term. A new puppet government was installed in Kabul, and for a moment, it appeared the Soviet Union had successfully managed a crisis through decisive force. But they had fundamentally miscalculated the nature of the conflict. They had prepared for a conventional war against a state, but they had walked into a holy war against a people. The invasion transformed a localized civil war into a massive, internationalized proxy conflict. Suddenly, The mountains of Afghanistan became the new front line of the Cold War. The United States, still reeling from the trauma of Vietnam, saw a golden opportunity to strike back at Soviet expansionism. Through Operation Cyclone, the CIA began funneling billions of dollars in weapons and funding to the Mujahideen, often utilizing Pakistan as a conduit. The invasion had turned Afghanistan into a global chessboard. The Soviet Union was no longer just fighting a rebellion. They were fighting a decentralized, religiously motivated force backed by the world's superpowers. The new Cold War front had been opened, and it would become a graveyard for the Soviet dream of hegemony, proving that in the modern era, even a superpower could be bled white by the sheer force of asymmetric resistance. January 1980, Tokyo, Japan. While the Soviet Union became ensnared in the bloody, mountainous terrain of Afghanistan, a different kind of revolution was unfolding across the Pacific, one measured not in bullets and bayonets, but in transistors, microchips, and trade balances. For decades, the relationship between the United States and Japan had been defined by a singular, existential necessity: the containment of communism. In the shadow of the Korean War and the escalating tensions in Vietnam, Japan had been transformed from a defeated enemy into the unsinkable aircraft carrier of American interests in Asia. Under the umbrella of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, Tokyo provided the essential bases and logistical hubs that allowed Washington to project power across the Pacific Rim. In exchange, the United States provided a security guarantee that allowed Japan to focus its entire national energy inward, rebuilding its shattered economy through a policy of pacifism and rapid industrialization. This was the San Francisco System, a cornerstone of the American-led order in Asia. But as the 1970s bled into the 1980s, the nature of this partnership began to undergo a profound and uncomfortable metamorphosis. The enemy was no longer just the red tide of communism. A new, more subtle tension was emerging from within the alliance itself. The miracle of the Japanese economy had become a source of American anxiety. The very stability that the U.S. had helped foster had allowed Japan to evolve from a producer of cheap textiles into a global titan of high technology and heavy industry. By the early 1980s, the sight of Japanese consumer electronics, automobiles, and machinery dominating the American market was no longer seen as a sign of a successful democratic ally, but as a direct economic threat. The changing landscape was marked by a shift from military cooperation to intense economic friction. The Reagan administration, adopting a more assertive stance toward global competition, began to view Japan's massive trade surpluses with suspicion. The era of Japan bashing had arrived in the halls of Congress. Disputes over semiconductor technology, the rising cost of American imports, and the perceived unfairness of Japanese trade practices created a climate of protectionism and resentment. The alliance was being tested. Could two nations remain close strategic partners if they were perceived as bitter economic rivals? Furthermore, the geopolitical center of gravity was shifting. As the U.S. became increasingly bogged down in the Vietnam syndrome and the Afghan quagmire, Japan began to assert a more independent diplomatic identity. No longer content to be merely a junior partner in the American security architecture, Tokyo began to navigate the complexities of the regional order with greater autonomy, balancing its security reliance on Washington with its growing economic integration with the rest of Asia. The Cold War was no longer just a struggle between East and West, or communism and capitalism. It had become a complex, multi-layered competition where the lines between ally and competitor were increasingly blurred. In the Pacific, the bedrock of the American-led order was being reshaped, not by the fall of a regime, but by the unstoppable rise of an economic superpower that was simultaneously the United States' greatest shield and its most formidable challenger. January 1981, Washington, D.C. The inauguration of Ronald Reagan signaled a seismic shift in the American approach to the Cold War. For years, the United States had been characterized by the Vietnam Syndrome, a period of strategic hesitation and a reluctance to engage in large-scale military interventions. But the Reagan administration arrived with a mandate to reject containment in favor of a more aggressive posture: rollback. This was the essence of the Reagan Doctrine. It was a policy designed to provide overt and covert support to anti-communist resistance movements around the globe, aiming to destabilize Soviet-backed regimes and push the frontiers of the free world outward. While much of this doctrine played out in the jungles of Nicaragua or the mountains of Afghanistan, its implications for the Asian theater were profound, reshaping the military landscape of the Pacific Rim. In Asia, the Reagan Doctrine manifested as a massive, multi-front military buildup. The administration viewed the Soviet Union not merely as a competitor, but as an evil empire that had to be outspent, outgunned, and outpaced. This necessitated a radical expansion of the U.S. naval and technological footprint in the Western Pacific. The goal was clear: to ensure that the Soviet Pacific Fleet could never challenge American maritime supremacy or threaten the vital sea lanes that fueled the burgeoning economies of East Asia. The buildup was not just about numbers, but about technology. The 1980s saw the integration of high-tech warfare into the Pacific strategy. The deployment of advanced missile defense systems, stealth technology, and sophisticated satellite surveillance transformed the theater. The United States began to pivot its focus toward maritime strategy, emphasizing the ability to strike Soviet naval assets far from their home ports, effectively turning the Pacific into a contested zone of high-stakes technological maneuvering. This era of militarization forced a recalculation among Asian allies. In South Korea, the Reagan administration increased its military presence and deepened security cooperation to counter the growing North Korean threat, which was increasingly bolstered by Soviet and Chinese hardware. In the Taiwan Strait, the U.S. continued to provide the defensive capabilities necessary to deter a potential invasion from the mainland, maintaining a precarious balance of power. However, this military surge did not occur in a vacuum. It collided head-on with the economic tensions established in the previous decade. As the U.S. poured billions into military modernization, it was simultaneously engaged in a fierce struggle to maintain its economic hegemony. The Reagan administration's peace through strength philosophy meant that the United States was attempting to do two things at once: assert undisputed military dominance in the Pacific while simultaneously fighting a protectionist battle to protect its industrial base from the very allies that helped it achieve that strength. By the mid-1980s, the Pacific had become a theater of dualities. It was a region of unprecedented military readiness and high-tech escalation, yet it was also a region of intense economic friction. The Reagan Doctrine had successfully revitalized American resolve, but it had also heightened the complexity of the Asian landscape. The struggle was no longer a simple binary of East versus West. It was a high-stakes game of chess where the pieces were moving faster than ever before, driven by the dual engines of military might and global commerce. March 1985, the Amur River border. While the world's attention was fixed on the high-tech naval maneuvers of the Reagan administration in the Pacific, a different, more primal kind of tension was simmering along the vast, rugged landmasses of northern Asia. Here, far from the carrier strike groups and stealth satellites, the two titans of the communist world, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, were locked in a bitter, grinding confrontation that threatened to ignite a full-scale nuclear conflagration. To understand the volatility of the mid-1980s, one must look past the ideological facade of communist solidarity. The Sino-Soviet split was no longer just a diplomatic disagreement. It had evolved into a deep-seated, existential rivalry. What had begun decades earlier as a struggle for leadership of the global Marxist movement had hardened into a territorial and nationalist feud. The border, stretching thousands of miles through dense forests and frozen riverbeds, had become one of the most militarized frontiers on Earth. By the mid-1980s, this tension reached a fever pitch. The Soviet Union, feeling the pressure of the Reagan-era military buildup, had responded by pouring massive resources into its far eastern military districts. They built sprawling air bases, fortified mountain passes, and deployed heavy armored divisions along the Chinese frontier. Their goal was clear: to ensure that any Chinese attempt to reclaim lost territory would be met with overwhelming force. China, for its part, viewed the Soviet presence not as a defensive measure, but as a direct threat to its sovereignty. Under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, China was undergoing a period of radical economic reform, yet its military posture remained fiercely defensive and deeply suspicious of its northern neighbor. Beijing saw the Soviet Union as a social imperialist power, a predatory force that sought to encircle the Chinese state. The memory of the 1969 border clashes at Zhenbao Island remained a fresh wound, a reminder that the brotherhood of communism was a myth. This was a landscape of shadow warfare. Intelligence agencies on both sides operated with frantic intensity. Spies moved through the borderlands, and reconnaissance flights frequently skirted the limits of sovereign airspace. The risk of a miscalculation, a single nervous soldier firing a shot in the dark that could trigger a massive retaliatory strike, was a constant, terrifying reality for the millions living in the shadow of these massive military deployments. Crucially, this Sino-Soviet friction created a secondary layer of complexity for the United States. The Reagan administration found itself in a position of profound strategic opportunity. As the two communist giants glared at one another across the Amur and the Usheri rivers, the American policy of triangular diplomacy began to bear fruit. By maintaining a cautious, strategic relationship with China, Washington could effectively use Beijing as a silent weight on the scales, forcing the Soviet Union to divert its best troops and most expensive equipment away from the European front and toward the Asian interior. Thus, while the Reagan doctrine sought to roll back Soviet influence through military strength, the Sino-Soviet border conflict provided a natural, self-sustaining mechanism for doing exactly that. The two communist giants were so consumed by their own rivalry that they were inadvertently helping to facilitate the very containment the United States had long sought to achieve. The frozen borders of Asia were not just a line on a map. They were a fracture point in the communist bloc that would eventually contribute to the systemic instability of the entire Soviet Empire. 1985, Seoul, South Korea. While the heavy machinery of war sat idling along the frozen borders of the north, a different kind of engine was roaring to life in the south. It was not the rumble of T-72 tanks or the whine of MiG fighters, but the rhythmic, relentless pulse of the factory floor. As the Soviet Union and China remained locked in a costly, exhausting military stalemate, a group of nations along the Pacific Rim were quietly winning the most consequential battle of the Cold War, the battle for economic supremacy. These were the tiger economies: South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. To the casual observer in the mid-1980s, they appeared to be mere miracles of rapid industrialization. But through the lens of geopolitics, their ascent was a masterstroke of strategic containment. They were the living, breathing proof that the Western model of capitalism and export-oriented growth could outpace the rigid, command-driven economies of the communist bloc. The rise of the tigers was not an accident of history, but a product of the very tensions that had defined the previous 3 decades. Following the devastation of the Korean War and the instability of the post-colonial era, these nations had been transformed into vital bulwarks against the spread of communism. Under the umbrella of American security guarantees, they were granted something precious: the stability required to build. Washington realized that the most effective way to contain communism was not merely through the deployment of missiles, but through the deployment of markets. By integrating these Asian nations into the global trade network, the United States helped create a prosperous, capitalist buffer zone that stretched from the Sea of Japan to the Malacca Strait. By 1985, the results were undeniable. In South Korea, the miracle on the Han River had turned a war-torn agrarian society into a global leader in heavy industry and electronics. In Taiwan, a high-tech manufacturing hub was emerging that would eventually redefine the world's supply chains. These nations were no longer just recipients of aid. They were becoming engines of global demand. This shift fundamentally altered the economic warfare of the era. The Cold War was moving away from a contest of sheer territory and toward a contest of systemic efficiency. While the Soviet Union was bleeding resources into the Afghan desert and the Siberian frontier, trying to maintain a sprawling, inefficient empire, the tiger economies were lean, agile, and hyper-competitive. They were mastering the art of the microchip and the consumer good, creating a level of soft power and economic interconnectedness that the Soviet model simply could not match. The implications were profound. The success of the tigers sent a powerful signal to the developing world. Prosperity did not require the radical redistribution of the Marxist creed, but rather the disciplined integration of global capitalism. This economic gravity began to pull at the fringes of the communist world, creating internal pressures that no amount of military spending could suppress. As the 1980s progressed, the battlefield was shifting. The front lines were no longer just found in the trenches of the DMZ or the forests of the Amur River. They were being drawn in the ledgers of multinational corporations and the shipping lanes of the Pacific. The tigers were not just growing. They were fundamentally tilting the scales of global power, setting the stage for a world where economic strength would become the ultimate arbiter of geopolitical dominance. 1985, Moscow, Soviet Union. While the economic engines of the Pacific Rim were accelerating, the heart of the Soviet Empire was beginning to stutter. For decades, the Soviet Union had maintained its grip on Asia through a combination of massive military presence and the rigid imposition of the command economy. From the satellite states of Eastern Europe to the strategic partners in Southeast Asia and the uneasy coexistence with a reforming China, the Kremlin had projected an image of monolithic, unbreakable strength. But beneath the surface, the Soviet system was hollow. The heavy industry that had once fueled the triumphs of the Second World War had become a sclerotic burden, unable to transition into the high-tech, consumer-driven era being mastered by the Asian tigers. In March of 1985, a new wind began to blow through the halls of the Kremlin. Mikhail Gorbachev, a relatively young and reform-minded leader, ascended to the position of General Secretary. He inherited a superpower that was, in many ways, a superpower in name only, straining under the weight of an arms race it could no longer afford, a disastrous quagmire in Afghanistan, and a domestic economy that was stagnating. Gorbachev realized that for the Soviet Union to survive, it could not simply continue to outspend the West. It had to reinvent itself. He introduced a dual-track strategy of reform, glasnost or openness, to encourage political transparency, and perestroika or restructuring, to modernize the stagnant socialist economy. But in the context of the Cold War in Asia, perestroika was a double-edged sword. The intention was to inject market-like efficiencies into the Soviet system to save it. However, the very openness that Gorbachev championed began to act as a solvent on the ideological glue that held the communist bloc together. In the socialist states of Asia and the strategic outposts maintained by Soviet influence, the sudden introduction of political discourse and the realization of the West's and the Tigers' economic superiority created a dangerous friction. As the Soviet government attempted to decentralize control and allow for more economic autonomy, the central authority that had dictated the terms of Asian geopolitics for 40 years began to fray. The grip was loosening. The command and control mechanism that had allowed Moscow to project power into North Korea, Vietnam, and beyond was being dismantled from within. This internal restructuring had immediate and profound geopolitical consequences. The Soviet Union could no longer afford to be the banker of revolution or the guarantor of security for its distant allies. The massive subsidies and military commitments that had sustained communist regimes across the Asian continent were being diverted or cut to address the crisis at home. The weakening of the Soviet grip meant that the bipolarity of the Cold War was entering its twilight. The rigid lines of influence that had defined the map of Asia since 1945 were blurring. As the Soviet Union turned its gaze inward to repair its broken machinery, it left a vacuum in its wake, a vacuum that would soon be filled by the rapid rise of China and the shifting tides of a world no longer anchored by a single, monolithic communist superpower. The era of ideological certainty was ending, replaced by a volatile, uncertain, and increasingly multipolar reality. April 1989, Beijing, China. As the Soviet Union struggled to reform its internal machinery, a different kind of storm was gathering in the East. While Gorbachev's glasnost was attempting to breathe life into a dying system through openness, the leadership in Beijing viewed such liberalization with profound suspicion. For the Chinese Communist Party, the stability of the state was not a subject for debate. It was the prerequisite for the economic miracle they were desperately trying to engineer. The spark was the death of Hu Yaobang, a former party leader seen as a reformer. What began as a period of mourning quickly transformed into a massive, organized protest. Students, intellectuals, and workers flooded Tiananmen Square, demanding not just political reform, but an end to the corruption that had plagued the transition to a market economy. For weeks, the world watched through satellite feeds as a sea of humanity occupied the heart of the Chinese capital, challenging the very foundation of the party's authority. The tension reached a breaking point in early June. Fearing that the protests would lead to a total loss of control, a chaotic unraveling similar to what was being whispered about in the Eastern Bloc, the hardliners in Beijing won the internal power struggle. The order was given. The military would clear the square by any means necessary. The arrival of the People's Liberation Army, accompanied by tanks and armored vehicles, turned a peaceful occupation into a massacre. The images of the crackdown sent shockwaves across the globe, signaling to the world that while China might be opening its doors to global capital, it was slamming them shut on political pluralism. The China model was being forged in blood, economic liberalization paired with absolute political control. But as the smoke cleared in Beijing, the tremors of 1989 were crossing the Eurasian landmass toward Europe, triggering a domino effect that would irrevocably alter the Asian landscape. November 1989, Berlin, Germany. The fall of the Berlin Wall was the seismic event that signaled the definitive end of the old order. As the physical barrier between East and West crumbled, the ideological barrier that had partitioned the world since the end of the Second World War evaporated. The Iron Curtain was no longer a metaphor, it was a relic. For Asia, the implications were tectonic. The collapse of communist regimes in Eastern Europe meant that the Soviet Union's strategic architecture was disintegrating. The monolithic communist bloc, which had once seemed an impenetrable wall of influence stretching from the Elbe to the Yellow Sea, was shattering. The satellite states that had served as buffers or ideological anchors were gone. As the wall fell, the bipolarity that had defined Asian geopolitics for nearly half a century collapsed. The Cold War was not merely ending, it was being rewritten. The disappearance of a unified, Soviet-led communist front meant that the old rules of containment and proxy warfare were becoming obsolete. In their place, a new, more complex reality was emerging. The vacuum left by the retreating Soviet shadow was being rapidly occupied by the rising economic power of China and the burgeoning influence of a democratic, globalized West. 1989 was the year the world learned that the structures of the past were far more fragile than they appeared. The era of the great ideological struggle was over. The era of the great economic competition had begun. December 1991, Moscow, Russia. The final, decisive blow did not come from a battlefield, but from the internal implosion of the Soviet center itself. As the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, the geopolitical earthquake sent massive tidal waves crashing across the Asian continent. The superpower that had once stood as the ideological counterweight to the United States, the very anchor of the communist bloc in Asia, had ceased to exist. With the dissolution of the USSR, the bipolarity that had governed Asian security since 1945 vanished almost overnight. For decades, the strategic calculus of every nation in the region, from the divided peninsula of Korea to the jungles of Vietnam, had been dictated by the tension between Washington and Moscow. Now, that axis was broken. The great game of the 20th century had lost its primary players, leaving behind a landscape of profound uncertainty and sudden, terrifying opportunity. In North Asia, the disappearance of Soviet patronage forced a radical reevaluation of survival. North Korea, once a key strategic partner and ideological sibling to the Soviet Union, suddenly found itself adrift in a sea of shifting loyalties, facing a world where its primary benefactor had essentially evaporated. To the north, the newly independent states emerging from the Soviet wreckage, such as Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, faced the daunting task of forging sovereign identities in a post-ideological world, navigating the vacuum left by the departing Red Army. In Southeast Asia, the end of the Cold War signaled a slow thaw in the frost of conflict. The ideological rigidities that had fueled proxy wars in Indochina began to soften. Without the driving force of the Sino-Soviet split or the Soviet-backed pressure in Vietnam, the regional powers began to look toward a different kind of security: economic integration. The ASEAN bloc, once a bulwark against the red tide of communism, began to transition into a forum for regional stability and economic cooperation. However, the collapse did not merely bring peace. It brought a vacuum. The retreat of Soviet influence meant that the old containment strategies were no longer sufficient. The strategic focus began to shift from preventing the spread of communism to managing the rise of new, non-ideological powers. The most significant beneficiary of this collapse was China. While the Soviet system had buckled under the weight of its own contradictions, the Chinese Communist Party had watched, learned, and adapted. As the Soviet shadow receded, the China model, the synthesis of state control and market dynamism, emerged as the dominant force in the East. The geopolitical center of gravity was no longer shifting between two poles. It was coalescing around a single, rising sun. The end of the Cold War in Asia did not bring the end of history that many had predicted. Instead, it replaced the predictable binary struggle of ideologies with a far more volatile, multipolar reality. The era of the superpower standoff was over. In its place rose an era defined by economic hegemony, maritime competition, and the complex, intertwined destinies of a globalized Asia. The world was no longer divided by an iron curtain, but by the rising tides of economic competition and the search for a new order in a world without poles. 1992, Bangkok, Thailand. As the dust settled from the collapse of the Soviet Union, the geopolitical atmosphere in Southeast Asia underwent a profound and disorienting metamorphosis. For nearly half a century, the region had been a chessboard for the giants. Whether it was the dense jungles of Vietnam, the mountainous terrain of Laos, or the fractured politics of Cambodia, every local movement had been viewed through the lens of the global struggle between capitalism and communism. But as the Soviet anchor vanished, the ideological gravity that had held these conflicts in place suddenly failed. This was the birth of the power vacuum. In the immediate wake of the Soviet withdrawal, the old rules of engagement were rendered obsolete. The containment doctrine, which had served as the bedrock of American foreign policy in the Pacific, found itself without a clear enemy to contain. The specter of a monolithic communist expansion, the very nightmare that had driven the domino theory, began to fade, replaced by a much more complex and unpredictable reality. In Indochina, the vacuum triggered a frantic period of realignment. Vietnam, once the vanguard of Soviet influence in the South, found itself isolated and economically crippled. Without the massive subsidies and military hardware of Moscow, the Hanoi government was forced into a pragmatic, often painful, pivot toward the West and toward regional integration. The long-standing hostilities between Vietnam and the ASEAN nations began to thaw, not out of sudden friendship, but out of a shared necessity to navigate a world where the old protectors were gone. Cambodia, a nation that had been torn apart by the collision of superpower interests and radical ideologies, entered a fragile period of transition. The disappearance of the Soviet-backed patrons meant that the regional stalemate could no longer be sustained by external life support. It forced a localized resolution, paving the way for the 1991 Paris Peace Accords to finally take root, but the shadow of the vacuum remained. The fear was no longer that a single ideology would sweep the region, but that the lack of a stabilizing superpower presence would allow smaller, regional tensions to boil over into chaos. For the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, the vacuum presented both an existential crisis and a historic opportunity. For decades, ASEAN had functioned primarily as a defensive bloc, a political shield against the perceived red tide. Now, with the tide receding, the organization had to redefine its very purpose. The focus shifted from military readiness and ideological survival to economic development and regional autonomy. The vacuum left by the superpowers was being filled by a new, homegrown pursuit of stability through trade and diplomatic consensus. Yet beneath this movement toward cooperation, a new tension was simmering. As the bipolar struggle died, the space was being rapidly occupied by emerging regional players. The withdrawal of the Soviet shadow did not leave a void of power, but rather a space for competition. The strategic focus of the United States began to drift, leaving behind a landscape where middle powers and rising giants began to assert their own interests. The question was no longer, who will win the ideological war? But rather, in this new, unanchored world, who will command the seas and the markets? The era of the proxy war was ending, but the era of the regional power struggle was just beginning. 1995, Singapore. As the regional tremors of the early 90s began to stabilize, a new and more complex architecture of power was being drafted across the Asian continent. The disappearance of the bipolar struggle between Washington and Moscow had not resulted in a peaceful, unified New World Order, as many had hoped. Instead, it had catalyzed the emergence of a multipolar Asia, a landscape defined not by two clashing ideologies, but by a dense, interlocking web of competing national interests, economic ambitions, and regional hierarchies. The departure of the Soviet Union had fundamentally altered the calculus of power. For decades, Asian nations had been forced to choose sides, their domestic policies and military alignments dictated by the gravity of the superpowers. But as that gravity failed, the middle powers of Asia began to realize they no longer had to be mere satellites. This was the era of strategic autonomy. Nations that had once been pawns were now becoming players, seeking to navigate the shifting tides of the Pacific and Indian Oceans on their own terms. At the heart of this metamorphosis was the realization that power was being redefined. While the Cold War was fought with tanks, missiles, and ideological fervor, the new era of competition would be waged through the relentless pursuit of economic hegemony. The tiger economies, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong, had proven that the battlefield of the future was the marketplace. Their meteoric rise signaled to the world that the center of gravity in the global economy was irrevocably shifting toward the east. This economic vitality provided these nations with a new kind of leverage, a soft power that could be wielded just as effectively as a military alliance. However, this multipolarity was not merely a story of rising prosperity. It was also a story of growing friction. As the old ideological boundaries dissolved, they were replaced by more traditional and often more volatile geopolitical rivalries. The vacuum left by the superpowers allowed long-simmering disputes over territory, resources, and maritime borders to resurface with renewed intensity. In the South China Sea, the quietude of the post-Cold War years masked a growing scramble for control over vital sea lanes and untapped energy reserves. The rules of the road were being rewritten in real time, and the lack of a singular, dominant superpower meant there was no longer a clear referee to enforce them. Furthermore, the rise of a multipolar Asia meant that the United States could no longer manage the region through simple containment. The American presence was transitioning from a role of policeman to one of a partner among many, forced to balance its interests against a diversifying array of actors. The emergence of a more assertive China, the strategic maneuvering of an increasingly independent India, and the consolidated regionalism of an expanded ASEAN meant that any single power would have to contend with a multitude of competing centers of influence. The era of the great game had not ended. It had simply changed its players and its stakes. The predictable, binary world of the Cold War was dead. In its place rose an Asia that was more vibrant, more economically potent, and infinitely more complicated. It was a continent where power was no longer concentrated in two distant capitals, but was instead distributed across a dozen different directions, setting the stage for the intense, multi-dimensional competition that defines our modern world. 1992. Beijing. While the rest of the world was still processing the geopolitical shockwaves of the Soviet collapse, a quiet, tectonic shift was occurring within the borders of the People's Republic of China. For much of the 20th century, China had been defined by its contradictions. A revolutionary giant that had spent decades in a state of self-imposed isolation, swinging between radical ideological fervor and the crushing weight of economic stagnation. But as the Cold War's binary logic dissolved, China was beginning to execute a transformation that would fundamentally rewrite the global order. To understand this ascent, one must look back at the scars of the previous era. For decades, China's economic policy had been a prisoner of ideology. Under the shadow of Maoism, the nation had prioritized autarky, self-sufficiency at any cost, often at the expense of its own people. The Great Leap Forward and the subsequent chaos of the Cultural Revolution had left the country impoverished, disconnected from the burgeoning global markets that were beginning to enrich its neighbors. China was a sleeping dragon, massive in potential, but trapped in a cycle of subsistence and political volatility. The pivot began not with a sudden explosion, but with a calculated, pragmatic retreat from the purity of revolution. Following the death of Mao and the ascension of Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leadership recognized a hard truth. If the Communist Party was to survive, it had to deliver prosperity. The ideological battleground was being replaced by the ledger of the marketplace. Through the reform and opening up policy, China began to dismantle the iron walls of its isolation, piece by piece. The creation of special economic zones, most notably in Shenzhen, served as the laboratory for this new reality. Here, the state experimented with the very thing it had once sought to destroy, capitalism. By inviting foreign investment and embracing export-oriented manufacturing, China began to plug itself into the global supply chain. It was a move of profound strategic genius. China was no longer trying to defeat the West through military confrontation or ideological subversion. It was seeking to become indispensable to the West through economic integration. By the early 1990s, this strategy was yielding unprecedented results. The Made in China label began to appear on every corner of the globe. The country was transforming from a rural, agrarian society into the world's factory floor. This wasn't just about growth. It was about the accumulation of national strength. Every factory built, every port expanded, and every dollar earned in foreign exchange served to fuel a massive buildup of domestic infrastructure and technological capability. As we move into the mid-90s, the implications of this ascent became clear. China was no longer a peripheral actor in the Cold War's aftermath. It was becoming the gravitational center of a new kind of power. Its integration into the global economy created a paradox that the post-Cold War world was ill-equipped to handle. On one hand, China's growth provided a massive engine for global prosperity, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty and fueling the rise of the Asian middle class. On the other hand, this economic integration was providing the very resources China would eventually use to challenge the established geopolitical status quo. The dragon was no longer sleeping. It was waking up, and it was doing so by mastering the rules of the global market. 1992, New Delhi. As the dragon in the north began to awaken through the engines of global capitalism, a different, more complex transformation was unfolding in the heart of South Asia. If China's ascent was defined by a sudden, massive pivot toward economic integration, India's rise was a more gradual, deliberate, and deeply complicated reassertion of its place on the world stage. For much of the Cold War, India had been the quintessential practitioner of the middle path. Under the leadership of Jawaharlal Nehru, the nation had become the moral and political anchor of the non-aligned movement, seeking to navigate the treacherous waters between the American and Soviet blocs without being swallowed by either. But the end of the Cold War changed the calculus of survival. The bipolar world that had allowed India to play both sides was gone, replaced by a unipolar moment dominated by the United States. For New Delhi, this was a period of profound strategic reckoning. India could no longer rely on the ideological shield of non-alignment to mask its structural vulnerabilities. The nation was grappling with a stagnant economy, a bloated bureaucracy, and the lingering shadows of its fractured relationship with a rapidly modernizing China. The turning point arrived in 1991, facing a severe balance of payments crisis that brought the nation to the brink of economic collapse. India was forced to make a choice that would echo through the decades. Much like China's pragmatic retreat from Maoism, India began a painful but necessary liberalization. The dismantling of the license Raj, the stifling system of state controls, opened the gates to foreign capital and global markets. This was not merely an economic policy, it was a geopolitical necessity. To compete in a post-Cold War era, India realized it needed the kind of hard power that only economic vitality could provide. As the 1990s progressed, this newfound economic momentum began to translate into a more assertive strategic posture. India began to shed its image as a purely pacifist, non-aligned actor and started to act as a burgeoning regional power. The realization was clear. In a world no longer defined by the struggle between communism and capitalism, power would be defined by the ability to project influence across the Indian Ocean and maintain autonomy in a shifting, multipolar landscape. This era also saw the deepening of old wounds. The relationship with China, once defined by the ideological clashes of the Cold War, was transitioning into a new, more dangerous phase, a competition for regional hegemony. As China's economic engine accelerated, India found itself in a race to modernize its own military and technological capabilities. The border disputes that had simmered since 1962 were no longer just territorial disagreements. They were becoming the fault lines of a new era of Asian competition. By the turn of the millennium, the picture was becoming clear. The geopolitical landscape of Asia was no longer a game played between two superpowers with two ideologies. It was becoming a complex, multi-layered arena where new giants were emerging. China was building its strength through the factory floor and the marketplace, while India was carving out a path through economic liberalization and strategic autonomy. The era of the proxy war was receding, but the era of great power competition was just beginning. The weight of Asia was shifting, and the center of gravity was moving decisively toward the east. 2024. The Himalayas. High above the clouds, amidst the jagged, frozen peaks of the line of actual control, the ghosts of the Cold War continue to haunt the modern geopolitical landscape. Here, in the thin air of the world's highest mountain range, the scars of 20th-century ideological struggles have solidified into permanent, militarized frontiers. The borders drawn by retreating colonial powers and redrawn by the shifting tides of the Cold War were never meant to be stable. They were products of chaos, proxy conflicts, and the strategic whims of superpowers. Today, those unfinished lines have become some of the most volatile flashpoints on the planet. To understand why these disputes remain so intractable, one must look back at the logic of the Cold War era. During that time, borders in Asia were often treated as tactical chess pieces. In the Korean Peninsula, a line drawn by diplomats in a war-torn room became a permanent scar of division. In Southeast Asia, the borders of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were shaped by the violent collision of communist insurgencies and Western containment strategies. These were not just lines on a map. They were ideological barriers designed to separate worlds. When the bipolarity of the Cold War collapsed, the ideologies faded, but the geography remained. The territorial disputes that simmered beneath the surface of the Sino-Soviet split, the Sino-Indian War, and the various conflicts in Indochina did not vanish with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Instead, they evolved. What were once struggles over the spread of Marxism-Leninism have transformed into modern struggles over sovereignty, resource security, and national prestige. In the South China Sea, the legacy of post-war maritime ambiguity has fueled a massive geopolitical storm. The overlapping claims of China, Vietnam, the Philippines, and others are a direct inheritance of a period when maritime boundaries were secondary to the strategic need for naval dominance and the containment of influence. The Nine-Dash Line is a modern manifestation of an era where sea lanes were viewed through the lens of superpower access. And today, those same lanes are the arteries of global trade, making every territorial claim a matter of existential economic importance. Similarly, the friction between China and India along the Himalayan frontier is a direct consequence of the unresolved tensions of the 1960s. The lack of a clearly demarcated border, a byproduct of the era's rapid decolonization and regional instability, has left both nations in a perpetual cycle of brinkmanship. As both Beijing and New Delhi project their growing hard power, these frozen conflicts are thawing into active military confrontations, proving that the end of the Cold War did not bring the end of history, but rather the beginning of a new, more localized competition. The legacy of the proxy wars is thus a landscape of permanent tension. The world has moved from a struggle between two global ideologies to a struggle between rising regional giants. However, the theater of conflict remains the same. The disputed mountains, the contested islands, and the contested waters. The shadows of the 20th century have lengthened, stretching across the 21st, reminding us that while the Cold War is over, the fractures it created are still very much alive. 2024. Washington, D.C. and the corridors of power, the terminology of the past is being systematically replaced. The phrase Asia-Pacific is fading, superseded by a new, more expansive concept, the Indo-Pacific. This shift in language is not merely semantic. It is a profound acknowledgement that the geopolitical center of gravity has permanently migrated. The era of the Cold War, defined by a rigid bipolar struggle between East and West, has been replaced by an era defined by the interconnectedness of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, a vast, maritime theater where economic prosperity and military dominance are inextricably linked. We have transitioned from a world of ideological containment to a world of strategic competition. If the Cold War was a battle of ideas, communism versus capitalism, the Indo-Pacific era is a battle of systems and spheres of influence. The primary tension no longer exists between two monolithic blocks, but rather between the established liberal international order and the rising ambitions of a multipolar Asia. At the heart of this new reality is the meteoric ascent of China. Beijing has moved from the periphery of the Cold War's ideological battlefield to the very center of the global economic and military engine. The century of humiliation that fueled much of the 20th century's instability has been replaced by a drive for national rejuvenation, challenging the hegemony that the United States and its allies maintained in the decades following the Soviet collapse. Yet this is not a simple tale of a new superpower replacing an old one. The Indo-Pacific is a complex, multi-layered mosaic. We see the rise of middle powers, nations like India, Japan, Australia, and Vietnam, that refuse to be mere pawns in a new great power competition. These nations are navigating a precarious path, seeking to reap the benefits of global trade while securing their sovereignty against the gravitational pull of larger neighbors. They are the architects of a new regionalism, forming minilateral groupings and security pacts that reflect a desire for a balance of power that is far more nuanced than the blunt instruments of the 1950s. As we look toward the future, the echoes of the Cold War serve as both a warning and a roadmap. The lessons of the past teach us that proxy conflicts, unchecked arms races, and the disregard for local sovereignty only lead to protracted suffering. The technological revolutions of the 21st century, from artificial intelligence to hypersonic missiles, have raised the stakes of competition to unprecedented levels. The struggle for influence is no longer just about territory or ideology. It is about the control of semiconductor supply chains, the mastery of undersea data cables, and the dominance of space. The history of the Cold War in Asia is not a closed chapter. It is a foundational text. The fractures it carved into the mountains, the seas, and the political structures of the continent continue to dictate the movements of modern states. We are living in the aftermath of a long, violent transition. Whether the Indo-Pacific era becomes a period of managed competition or descends into the kind of systemic conflict that defined the 20th century remains the defining question of our time. The shadows of the past are long, but the light of the future is being cast by the rising powers of the East, shaping a world that is no longer defined by a curtain, but by a vast, turbulent, and interconnected ocean.